Hi everyone, very happy to be with you this evening. My name's Arjun Sethi. Thank you for the generous, kind introduction, Imran, out in Phoenix. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the National Week of Resistance and No Muslim Ban Ever, a campaign that started on Monday and that's going to be continuing into next week. As many of you know, oral arguments are scheduled to happen in both the Fourth Circuit Muslim ban litigation and in the Ninth Circuit as well. The Fourth Circuit had oral arguments on Monday. And as a refresher, in the Fourth Circuit, the court blocked the Muslim ban, but did not block the refugee ban. On Monday, the Ninth Circuit will be holding oral arguments in the Muslim ban litigation, and that was a much more broader holding. And there, the court blocked both the Muslim travel ban and the refugee ban. So, in connection with the oral arguments in both cases, both in Seattle and Richmond, Virginia, we have organized a National Week of Resistance. The hashtag that we are using online is No Muslim Ban Ever. I would encourage everyone to get involved, and my remarks tonight will be a little about the Muslim ban and about different ways in which individuals can get involved and ways to anticipate what we can expect going forward. When thinking about the Muslim ban, we should start really with what Donald Trump said on the campaign trail. He promised to ban Muslims, right? He never hid his intention. And in fact, we now know that he actually asked one of his senior advisors at the time, Rudy Giuliani, to prepare a memorandum that would allow for the justification for banning Muslims. So again, this is something he had been thinking about for a while. He had asked his senior advisor to come up with a legal regime that would justify it as well. After he became president, as we also saw, President Trump has been reticent and hesitant to condemn things like hate violence against Muslims, Sikhs, Arabs as well. So I think it's safe to say that this is an administration that for the most part is interested in criminalizing our communities, doesn't necessarily have an issue with hate or hate violence impacting our communities. So with that framework in mind, I'll talk a little bit about the Muslim ban and the different iterations. So the first Muslim ban that was announced applied to 7 Muslim majority countries. It stopped individuals from those 7 Muslim majority countries from traveling to the United States. That order also blocked all refugee admissions for 120 days as well. The Muslim ban part of the order at the time actually applied not just to foreign nationals, but it applied to, the beginning at least, dual nationals, LPRs, lawful permanent residents, etc., asylum seekers, etc. So it was extraordinarily sweeping. That order also banned indefinitely all Syrian refugees and prioritized Christian and Jewish refugees from Muslim majority countries. So again, the first Muslim ban executive order stopped travel to the United States from 7 Muslim majority countries for 90 days, blocked all refugee admissions for 120 days, indefinitely stopped and banned all Syrian refugees, and then finally prioritized Christian and Jewish refugees from Muslim majority countries. That executive order, as many of you all remember, was challenged in court and repeatedly found to violate the Constitution. So what Trump decided to do was promulgate a second order, what many call Muslim Ban 2.0. And in large measure, it's not very different from the first order. So in this case, instead of applying to 7 Muslim majority countries, the Muslim ban order applies to 6 Muslim majority countries. It likewise blocks refugees indefinitely, refugees for 120 days. And that also applies to the Syrian refugee population. So unlike the first order, which banned Syrian refugees indefinitely. The second order didn't have a special carve out for Syrian refugees and just found and made the general rule applicable to them, which would be a 120-day ban. And courts that have looked at the second iteration of the Muslim ban have for the most part found that it violates the Constitution, just like the first iteration of the Muslim ban. And that's for a few reasons. One, the Constitution prohibits, under what's called the Establishment Clause, the favoring of one faith over another. And what the courts have found is that the travel ban, as Trump calls it, is in fact a Muslim ban, because it applies to Muslim majority countries. And in doing so, it favors one religion or multiple religions over another. In this case, the Muslim ban favors Christianity, Judaism, all other faiths over Islam. And courts that have looked at this, again, have found that the travel ban violates the Establishment Clause. The other legal rule that has been implicated, at least in some of the cases in the litigation, is equal protection. The idea there is that we all have the right to equal protection under the law. And the courts have found that, again, this ban, because it infringes acutely on Muslims, violates the promise of equal protection under the law. There are also interesting due process issues. Those are a little more complicated, but what I can safely say is this: the right to travel, at least in the United States, for Americans, for residents, etc., is actually protected under the Constitution. So courts have also been considering to what extent this executive order also implicates due process, namely that it robs individuals of the right to travel, to freely move without any type of procedural protection, meaning that if you are going to stop and impede somebody's ability to move, you have to have some type of judicial safeguards in place. And one of the things that's also animating the court's decision, which I think is very important, is that the courts have been very focused on Trump's rhetoric, both on the campaign trail and even in some cases looking at his tweets. And this is important because it goes to show that the courts aren't just going to look at the face of the statute, which is what the government wants them to do. They're actually going to look at what some call bad faith. And again, whether there is evidence that can be found from Donald Trump's Twitter line, from his campaign speeches on the campaign trail, which evinces sort of this animus towards Muslims. And in doing so, they have found that more likely than not, this travel ban is likely unconstitutional because, again, it violates the Establishment Clause, it violates equal protection under the law, and is motivated by this animus towards Islam and Muslims. That's a little bit of the architecture. And so folks have a sense of how the Muslim travel ban impacted individuals. The impacts were extraordinary, enduring, and many. In many cases, it jeopardized people's ability to get health care. There were individuals from these countries who had planned trips to the United States to receive life-saving medical care. Their ability to obtain that health care has been compromised. In some cases, it has separated families. Imagine you have been on the wait list to come to the United States. You've waited your turn in line, and all of a sudden you've told, after you've bought your ticket, I'm sorry, you don't have the right to come here any longer. So it separated families. In some cases, we've had students who were enrolled in universities in the United States who had difficulty coming back into the country. And then, of course, all of the intangibles, right? The deferment of dreams, the reputational harm, the chilling effect that Muslim Americans experience and feel knowing that President Trump doesn't want individuals from Muslim majority countries coming to this country. So those are some of the effects and some of the consequences that have happened as a result of the travel ban. One thing I think we should be mindful of is thinking about what could be next. And we don't know how the two court cases are going to play out. If the courts come to different decisions, it's my opinion that both courts will find, just like the district courts, that the Muslim ban is unconstitutional. That said, the Supreme Court might decide to take it up. And at that point, we'll see what the Supreme Court decides. But it's possible that President Trump doesn't appeal it. It's hard to say. What I do think will happen, regardless of what the courts decide, is that we will see new hyper extreme forms of vetting. So as many people know, the United States already has an extraordinarily robust, I would say, invasive protocol for determining whether individuals should be admitted to the United States. In the case of refugee admissions, it's actually a 2-year process. So we already have what I would call an extreme vetting regime. But I think you're going to see an intensification in what I call hyper extreme vetting. So the Trump administration has actually recently announced that the visa interview process is actually going to be much more invasive. Instead of asking questions about people's familial history, social history, political history, for example, over the last 5 years, they're going to ask for history going back 10 or 15 years. Furthermore, the guidelines actually allow for CBP officers to ask individuals from foreign countries seeking admission to the United States for their social media identifiers, right? So the government can actually look at their social media profiles, vet them, etc. So we also need to be thinking about that President Trump, if he doesn't get his way with his executive orders, might try a more roundabout, circuitous way to ultimately stop Muslims from coming to the United States through a very extreme vetting process that would just make it less likely that individuals who have legitimate reasons to be in the United States, education, healthcare, visiting family, tourism, are less likely to be admitted. But again, just this broader chilling effect, right? Individuals are much less likely to apply for a visa if they know they will be subject to an invasive interview, searched online, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing we should be thinking about, and again, it's important not to lose sight of this, is that one proposal the Trump administration was very seriously contemplating in the first few weeks of the administration of the presidency was designating the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. And that would have been extraordinarily problematic for a lot of reasons. For those of you who actually follow these issues closely, you will know that there is a very robust Islamophobia industry in the United States. Its annual budget is in excess of $50 million, and their favorite smear tactic is to accuse Muslim American activists, public interest organizations, and anybody who is aligned with them as supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. And as background, the Muslim Brotherhood is a organization that was created in Egypt in the 1920s that tried to instill Islamic values into everyday life. It has since grown into the largest opposition party in Egypt and has offshoots in some form or shape across the Middle East. But again, the Trump administration wanted to designate the Muslim Brotherhood a foreign terrorist organization because they wanted to use that to go after public interest organizations here in the United States, go after activists here in the United States by somehow saying that they were connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. Fortunately, for now, that proposal seems to have been tabled, both because of pushback by public interest organizations, pushback by the State Department. The State Department actually came out and opposed the designation because they cited the fact that President Obama did his own investigation and decided the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't a terrorist organization. The British government did their own study a couple years ago and decided not to designate the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. And even the CIA actually came out and said it would have been a bad move for a whole host of reasons. But nevertheless, something to just think about. I'd also remind you that it's easy sometimes to think that some of the programs that I'm talking about, the travel ban, the Muslim ban, the refugee ban, hyper extreme vetting, the possibility of designating the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, came out of nowhere. In fact, they didn't. And we shouldn't lose sight of all the various ways in which Muslim, Arab, Sikh, and South Asian communities have been criminalized prior to Trump taking office. So I'll spend just a couple of minutes going over some of those because, again, it laid the foundation in some ways for the policies we're seeing now. Programs like watch lists, right? The United States has a master terrorist watch list that has roughly 700,000 individuals on it. And the standard for getting on the watch list is so extraordinarily broad that you can be on the watch list if the State Department determines you are a known terrorist, or if one of various executive agencies believes there is reasonable suspicion to believe you are a suspected terrorist, right? So reasonable suspicion to believe you are a suspected terrorist. So the standard is extraordinarily broad. And that's why the guidance actually allows for an individual to be designated a terrorist on the basis of a single social media post. Shocking. So again, we've seen with the watch list that it disproportionately impacts Muslim Americans. Fact, Dearborn, Michigan, a city with less than 100,000 residents, has more watch listed residents than any other city in the country except for New York. Why? Because of Dearborn, Michigan's high, a large Muslim and Arab American population. So we know that it disproportionately impacts Muslim and Arab Americans. We know that it implicates profound constitutional rights. Again, this idea that you could somehow be branded a terrorist on the basis of a single social media post. And even intellectually, it actually shouldn't make much sense to you. So for example, consider the no-fly list. The no-fly list is a subsidiary list, right? A sub-list of the broader master terrorist watch list. If you are on the no-fly list, you can't fly to, from, or over American skies, right? But there's an inherent contradiction here, right? You are too dangerous to fly, but not dangerous enough to arrest, right? That's sort of the oxymoron, a contradiction of the no-fly list. So again, the terrorist watch list system has disproportionately impacted Muslim and Arab Americans, has separated families, chilled legitimate constitutional and civil rights as well. Also be thinking about things like suspicious activity reporting. One of the perceived failures prior to 9/11 was that local law enforcement didn't have the ability to report a pre-terrorism planning to federal law enforcement. So what we saw after 9/11 was in many ways the intensification of the suspicious activity reporting program, which encourages and asks local law enforcement to report what they perceive to be suspicious activity to federal law enforcement so it can be investigated. The problem is, what is suspicious activity, right? So Constitutional Procedure 101. All of us have the right to go about our business and be left alone, right? We have the right to bodily integrity. We have the right to privacy, unless police or law enforcement have reasonable suspicion to believe that we have committed a crime or are in the process of committing a crime. The suspicious activity reporting program turns that standard on its head. Because again, it uses this broad criteria like pre-terrorism intelligence planning. Again, what is pre-terrorism intelligence planning? It is things like an Arab American going to Costco and buying pallets of water. It is a Muslim American woman with a hijab taking photos of a bridge. It's an Arab American going to Best Buy and purchasing home computers for his home business. Those are actually real cases, and those are some of the plaintiffs in a case that's pending in California that is challenging the constitutionality of the suspicious activity reporting program. There are other programs. The last program I will talk about, because I would feel remiss if I didn't, is CVE, Countering Violent Extremism Programs. This is, for me, as a form of predictive policing. One of the things that the government has tried to do is predict when a youth becomes a violent extremist, right? So the idea is, well, we need to stop lone wolf terrorism in the United States. And if we can somehow predict when a youth is likely to become a violent extremist, we can stop it, a terrorist attack, from happening. The problem with these programs, which are called Countering Violent Extremism Programs, is one, that they're based on junk science. So almost everybody who's actually studied violent extremism has found that the path to violent extremism is very case specific. It's very individualistic, and it can't be graphed on some kind of scale, meaning it can't be predicted. So the MI6 did a comprehensive study a few years ago, and that's the conclusion that they came up with. They actually interviewed violent extremists, and they found that there are no universal indicators. So that's the first problem. The second problem we've seen is because there are no universal indicators, the government basically makes them up as they go along. So some of the indicators that the government uses to determine whether a Muslim American is likely to become a violent extremist are things as absurd as becoming confrontational at home, a newfound interest in religiosity, using code words, etc. So we've had situations where Muslim Americans who have not stood for the Pledge of Allegiance, who've condemned drone strikes, who demonstrate a newfound interest in religiosity, are sometimes perceived as being en route to becoming violent extremists. And that obviously is absurd. And the case study I think about in that context is Ahmed Mohammed, the young African-American a Muslim boy in Texas who was suspended for bringing a homemade clock to school. So again, these programs are based on bad science. And because they're based on bad science, the US government uses these absurd indicators that don't work. And then, of course, that leads to the chilling of sacrosanct civil rights. So we found from cities that have CVE pilot programs that Muslim American youth are less likely to express themselves because they're worried about being profiled. They're worried about being visited by law enforcement. They're less likely to attend mosque. They're less likely to raise their hand in the classroom. These are sacrosanct rights, and we should really be encouraging Muslim Americans to engage in civic activism, not suppressing it. So having spoken a little bit about the Muslim ban, the refugee ban, what we can expect next, both perhaps the sort of hyper-extreme vetting, thinking about this MB designation issue, again, the Muslim Brotherhood designation issue, and then having also gone over the architecture that was in place prior to Trump that allowed for some of this to happen. I'd like to talk about different ways in which organizations and individuals and activists can get involved. So as I began with my remarks with, this week is the National Week of Resistance because of the oral arguments. Please use the hashtag #NoMuslimBanEver on social media communications and otherwise. So one of the things that we found is working is just organizing and rallying. As I said a few days ago on Twitter, and as I've said often, these judges aren't making their decisions in a vacuum. Popular opinion matters. It matters that people are showing up. It matters that people are striking. It matters that volunteers are showing up at airports, lawyers, to represent travelers from these countries. So the first thing I would say is be organized, rally, and condemn the Muslim ban. Secondly, and related to that, try to get civic associations involved. So for example, public health associations, universities, a lot of them have made very strong statements about how the Muslim ban is unconstitutional, how it is infringing upon healthcare, how it is chilling expression in universities, and in some cases, actually even separating students from universities. Three, think intersectionally. So again, no ban, no wall, no raids. Understanding that bans, walls, raids, these are all efforts meant to intimidate and exclude communities of color and other vulnerable groups. So think about ways in which we can build intersectionality, build solidarity amongst all these different issues. So again, thinking about walls, raids, and bans, and understanding how they're all interrelated. We've also found that a lot of the federal advocacy at this time, because of the Republican controlled Congress and, of course, this administration, they aren't particularly sensitive to civil rights issues. So it is especially important to lobby and work closely with local officials. Encourage your cities, encourage your towns, encourage your state legislators to condemn the Muslim ban, to not cooperate with the federal government, to not share things like immigration status of residents with the federal government, to not provide information relating to the residents' religious identity in anticipation of perhaps a Muslim registry down the line. And there, the California Values Act, which is legislation that has been introduced in California, is a very good model for a state law that seeks to limit a state's cooperation with the government with respect to things like bans, walls, and raids. Center those who are impacted. We found that sometimes the best way to persuade people is by centering those who are actually experiencing the discrimination. Stories matter. Human touch matters. So figure out a way to do that. Hold community events. This is a community event that's been put on this evening. Figure out ways, again, to get involved. We are all members of countless organizations. Maybe you're a member of a PTA. Maybe you're a member of a synagogue, a church, a community association. Create a space in that venue to talk about these issues. And again, try to center those who are impacted so they can tell their stories. Support groups. There are a lot of really great groups who are working on these issues. My colleagues and I have created a website called www. Okay, I think we got disconnected for a second. My colleagues and I have created a website called No Ban, No Wall, No Raids, .wordpress.com. It contains a list of organizations who are working on these issues. Connect with them, reach out if you can, support them. The last thing I would say is don't wait. Sometimes we feel like we need to wait until an event happens, whether it's the next criminalization policy, whether it's the next act of hate. Don't wait. There is an urgency to what's happening right now. Communities of color, in particular Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and Sikh Americans in this country, and immigrants as well, are being acutely impacted by criminalization policies, by hate violence, and so much more. So again, I would just encourage you to figure out ways to get involved as soon as possible. With that, I'll conclude my remarks and see if there are any questions. So one question I have right now is, what are the implications of the appeals right now? So like I said, there are two cases that are pending. There is a case in the Ninth Circuit in Seattle, and there's a case in the Fourth Circuit in Virginia. In the Ninth Circuit, the district court judge blocked basically the entirety of Muslim Ban 2.0. So the judge blocked the travel ban, the Muslim ban, and the refugee ban. In the Fourth Circuit, the decision, again in Virginia, was a little more narrow. The district court judge there just blocked the Muslim ban, but not the refugee ban. So the judges in both circuits are now considering the cases. Oral arguments happened in the Richmond case on Monday. Oral arguments would happen in the Seattle case next Monday. I think very likely the Ninth Circuit definitely will very likely affirm the decision of the district court and block the Muslim ban, which will mean that it's blocked. At which point, the Trump administration may very likely appeal it to the Supreme Court, and then we'll have to see what the Supreme Court says. So if I had to guess, it's likely that the Muslim ban at least will be blocked because the Ninth Circuit will likely block it. I'm less certain about the Fourth Circuit, but I think it's probable that they will block it as well. So to cut a long story short, I think the ban will continue to be blocked, and then you will very likely have an appeal to the Supreme Court. Looks like there's another question here. What is one of the biggest challenges the Muslim American community has with engaging with other Muslims? I'm not a Muslim American. Again, I teach and work and organize on these issues. So I'll speak a little more broadly and say, what are some of the biggest challenges that our communities generally, Muslim, Arab, Sikh, and South Asians, have dealing with one another? And I think one of them has got to be internal discrimination, internal racism, internal bias. For example, I don't think we do enough. We don't do enough to center Black Muslims and the experiences they face. They are disproportionately impacted by police brutality, police violence, surveillance, and criminalization. So I think we need to be having more serious conversations amongst our groups about bias, discrimination that we harbor for one another. And that's going to be hard work. Another question, will it help pressuring our Congress people on the ban? Sure. I think again, in my opinion, I think sort of it has not been this. It's very important right now to work locally. Your counties, your cities, your states can do a lot in making your hometown and making your state a more hospitable place for everyone, for all of us. So definitely focus locally, but yes, you should definitely be reaching out to your elected officials in Congress and asking them to condemn the Muslim ban and telling them about how the Muslim ban is affecting your community. So again, if you know of people in your community, if you know of constituents who are being impacted or their families are being impacted, yes, you should reach out to your elected official, elected representative, and express how you feel and tell them to condemn the Muslim ban and hold them to account. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have for now. Thank you everybody for joining. I hope this was helpful. Please again get involved with the National Week of Resistance and tweet and use the hashtag no Muslim ban ever. This is Arjun Sethi signing out.